Good morning, everyone. My name's Sharon Lewin. I'm the Director of the Doherty Institute, a joint venture of the University of Melbourne and Royal Melbourne Hospital. I'm really delighted that today we can launch and discuss this new study. As you all know, COVID-19 is a new disease and there are currently no treatments with established effectiveness, despite many clinical trials currently underway. And there are multiple treatment options and potentially combinations that could be effective. So today we're really pleased to tell you about a clinical trial, the Australian COVID-19 Trial, or ASCOT, which will specifically look at two existing drugs, lopinavir-ritonavir, a drug previously commonly used to treat HIV, and hydroxychloroquine used to treat arthritis and also prevent and treat malaria. Now, the ASCOT trial has been possible due to the generous support from philanthropic organisations, and that has included the Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital Foundation, Anthony Pratt and the Pratt Foundation, and more recently, the Minoru Foundation, whose contributions was just announced earlier today. So I'd like to introduce our panellists today. The trial is being led by Royal Melbourne Hospital infectious disease physician and co-lead of clinical research at the Doherty Institute, Associate Professor Steven Tong. Another principal investigator, Professor Josh Davis from the Hunter Medical Research Institute, Menzies School of Health Research, and also President of the Australasian Society for Infectious Diseases, or ACID, and a clinician researcher at the John Hunter Hospital, Newcastle. And ACID has also been a very important partner for this trial. Chief Investigator, Professor David Patterson from the University of Queensland Centre for Clinical Research and the Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital. Another Chief Investigator, Dr. Susan Morpeth from the Middlemore Hospital in Auckland, who will be joining us shortly. And also delighted to have Andrew Hagger join us, the Chief Executive of the Minoru Foundation. So I'm going to hand over to Steven Tong. Each of our panellists will speak for a few minutes and then we'll open it up for questions to all of the people online. So over to you, Steven.
Thanks very much, Professor Lewin. So really pleased for us to be able to talk about ASCOT today. It's a clinical trial that aims to discover which, if any, existing treatments are the most effective against COVID-19. This is a trial that will take place in Australia and New Zealand. And we're going to initially test the efficacy and safety of two existing drugs in patients who are hospitalised with COVID-19, but who aren't yet sick enough to require intensive care support. And the aim is really to see whether using these drugs will prevent patients from deteriorating to the point of needing a ventilator. And as Sharon mentioned, the drugs are lopinavir-ritonavir, which is currently used to treat HIV, and hydroxychloroquine, which is used to treat arthritis and prevent and treat malaria. Some studies have shown that these two drugs can work against the virus in the laboratory, but we need to now test them in patients to know for sure whether they will work in humans. Drugs that can show promise in the laboratory don't always translate to being effective in patients. The World Health Organization considers that both these drugs are promising treatments for COVID-19, but more research is needed so that we can be sure whether they are safe and effective. And this trial will assess whether it's better to use either drug alone or in combination compared to the standard of care.
Thanks, Steve. And now over to Josh Davis, please.
Yeah, thank you, Sharon. So this trial's going to involve over 70 hospitals around Australia in every state and territory, and also 11 in New Zealand. These sites have been engaged over a very short period of a few weeks, and that's really been made possible by the AustralaSian Society for Infectious Diseases Clinical Research Network, or CRN, that has a large network of sites. And we're also in discussion with colleagues in Singapore and several other countries overseas to potentially engage those regions also in the trial. So the ACID Clinical Research Network is a group of hospitals and clinical researchers from across Australia and New Zealand that was founded in 2010 and has previously run several national and international trials on severe bacterial infections. As we've mentioned, there are no currently proven effective therapies for COVID. And the World Health Organization and also Australia's Chief Medical Officer have said that antiviral and other experimental therapies for COVID-19 should only be used in the context of a clinical trial. So given that 30 of Australia's 31 principal referral hospitals will be participating in this trial, as well as many smaller Australian hospitals, it means that the majority of Australia and New Zealand patients will have access to COVID-19 treatments within the context of a clinical trial.
Great, thank you, Josh. And now over to David Patterson, who'll tell us a little bit about the design of the study.
Thanks very much, Sharon. ASCOT is a randomised trial, and that means that patients will be randomly allocated to different therapies. And in fact, in some cases, they will not receive any active antiviral therapy, but rather the best possible supportive care. By doing a randomised trial, we can objectively assess whether patients who've received a specific therapy fare better, worse, or the same compared to patients who received another therapy, or in fact receive the standard of care. And this is really the most rigorous way we can demonstrate the benefits or even the harms of therapies. Going into the trial design in a little bit more detail, ASCOT's also what's called a responsive adaptive trial. And that means if a drug is being shown to be particularly effective, we can adapt the trial so that more and more patients receive that particular type of therapy. On the other hand, if a drug isn't looking at being particularly effective or is causing severe side effects, we can stop that particular arm of the study. Having such a coordinated and rigorous approach means that not only can many patients participate in the study, but also that we can generate the evidence as quickly as possible. And ideally, if other potential treatments become available, we can put these also into the coordinated framework of ASCOT. I'd just like to very briefly acknowledge all of the people in Brisbane who've donated to the Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital Foundation to help get ASCOT off the ground.
Great, thank you, David. And I'll hand over now to Susan Morpeth, who's successfully joined, which is great to see you there, Susan, who'll tell us a bit about the trial and how it will proceed in New Zealand. Susan, you're on mute. If you could just unmute yourself.
Thanks very much, Sharon. So New Zealand has funding from the New Zealand Health Research Council to take part in the ASCOT study, which is great. We have 11 sites around the country preparing to take part in the study, which includes most of the major hospitals in New Zealand. We want to be able to offer New Zealanders the opportunity to participate in randomised controlled trials of treatment for COVID-19. We're doing really well at controlling coronavirus in New Zealand so far, but it's still important for us to be prepared. Because we've done well at controlling it, we will have a pan-susceptible, vulnerable population, and vaccine development could yet be a long way off. It's also important for us to get information on these potential treatments that become available in our unique population, particularly in our Maori and Pacific populations, where we know people are at particular risk for infectious and respiratory diseases and complications of those.
Great, thank you, Susan. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, ASCOT would not be possible without the generous support of philanthropy. This is actually quite unusual for most clinical trials in Australia, but given the urgency of establishing this clinical trial, philanthropy has been absolutely essential. So I'm really pleased and thankful to announce the Minoru Foundation has committed $1 million to the trial. And I'm just delighted that Andrew Hagger, the Chief Executive of the Minoru Foundation, is joining us today, who'll also say a few words. So over to you, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Sharon. Well, I'll just quickly cover the who, the what, and the why from Minoru's Foundation. For those that are not familiar with us, we send the greetings of Andrew and Nicola Forrest, who established this foundation, have been very involved in the announcement that we're making today. Minoru Foundation is one of Asia Pacific's largest philanthropies, with $2 billion committed to a range of initiatives. And when it comes to COVID-19, we're trying to play our part. We've committed up to $160 million across a range of initiatives, including the procurement of much needed equipment for Australia, community initiatives in Indigenous communities, for the homeless, various initiatives there providing basic needs. And then for clinical trials, we have today announced $1 million for the ASCOT trial. We're really delighted to do that. And so to cover the why of that, there are 3 reasons why. First one is we think this is a superb clinical trial. It's been well thought through. We think it has very good prospects in order to save lives and play a very important role in the global response to COVID-19. Secondly, it's the Doherty. And for us, I first met Peter Doherty 15 years ago, who's very helpful to me as a young CEO, but to watch the Doherty Institute come to life, Sharon, to you and to your team, you've been wonderful to deal with over the last few weeks. We have very high regard for you, and it means a lot to us. The Doherty Institute is in the centre of all this. And finally, we see the role of philanthropy, business and institutions coming together at a time like this. And we want to play our part. So we commend the research team. We're right behind you. We say to the patients, we're right behind you. We're delighted to be involved. And Sharon, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for the enthusiasm and support. It's just great to see. So I'll hand over now to Rebecca, who will field the questions from the online journalists at the moment. Thanks a lot.
Excellent. Now, can I ask everybody to raise your virtual hand if you have a question? And I'll ask you to say your name and where you're from. We'll first go to Isk Razik. Can you hear us?
I've unmuted myself. Why are we doing this trial? What is it specifically about these drugs that means that we have to do the trial here in Australia and New Zealand, particularly considering there are clinical trials in France and Brazil for that malaria drug that I will not try and pronounce? Why do we have to do it here in Australia?
Could I just ask, sorry, if you could tell us where you're from?
Sorry, Isk Razak from the ABC newsroom in Melbourne.
Thank you.
Thanks, Isk. I might ask Steven Tong to respond to that, please.
Oh, thanks for the question. I think that's a really important question. We're going to be keeping an eye on all the trials that are happening around the world. And because of the adaptive framework of this study, we can actually take into account the results that are occurring and adapt our trial accordingly. I think the main thing is that we really need to build up a framework in Australia that allows us to conduct clinical trials like this. And whilst we're starting with these 2 agents, the main point, I think, is that once we get the infrastructure up and going, we can adapt appropriately. So if it's shown that one of these treatments is completely ineffective or harmful, we can in fact drop that therapy. So the key point here is we're building up the infrastructure and it allows us to now try different therapies, experimental therapies, within a safe and ethical framework.
Thank you, Steve. I'll now hand over to Penny Durham. Please go ahead, Penny.
So, thank you. Hello.
Yes, hi, Penny. I think you're there.
Oh, great. Hello.
Everyone, where you're from.
Oh, yes. Thanks, everyone. I'm from the Medical Republic. I've got 2, but I'll just start with one. I read that this morning that Gilead had denied Ascot a supply of REM Desafio. Could you respond to that?
Josh, can I get you to respond to that?
Yeah, so REM Desafio, which is a drug that Gilead have produced in the past as an antiviral and is being tested currently against coronavirus, is not available generally in Australia. So Gilead have very limited amounts of the drug, and they've chosen to focus on countries that have a larger number of cases than Australia at the moment, including North America and Asian sites. For that reason, it's not part of the ASCOT trial presently. As Steve mentioned, we do have an adaptive design. So if remdesivir becomes available and is produced more by Gilead in the future, it can be added.
Okay, thank you. If I can have a second one, I don't want to hog it, but do you, on hydroxychloroquine, do you put any weight on the human studies conducted so far, such as that by Didier Raoult in France, or are you merely, or is all the evidence so far as you're concerned, from in vitro studies?
David, maybe I'll hand that to you.
This is a huge question, and it's a really important one. We do know that hydroxychloroquine does seem to have activity in the test tube. I have to say, you know, the reason why we're doing a large randomized trial is really to try and tease out all of this speculation and, I guess, confusing information that's coming out from these smaller studies, whether it be the French study or the Brazilian study. I mean, being able to do the study in more than 2,000 patients really should allow us to be very definitive in terms of, firstly, does the drug work? And secondly, what is its safety profile in patients with COVID-19? So a hugely important question, and hopefully one that we will be able to answer.
Thanks very much.
On to the next question. Sharon, can you please go ahead and just tell everybody where you're from?
Yes, hi, Sharon Crouch here from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. I've just got two really quick questions. The first one's very quick. I just wanted to make sure I didn't mishear you before, Josh. I think you were saying that the trial, because it's so big, it means that most COVID-19 patients in Australia will have access to treatment, at least in a trial context. Did I hear you right there?
Yes. Yeah, that's correct. So nearly all the large hospitals in Australia will participate, and many of the smaller ones as well.
Right. That's, I mean, understandably, you know, you were talking about placebos and things like that. So not everyone will have the treatment, but is it sort of the majority of people in the trials will have one of the drugs?
Yeah, there are 4 arms currently. So 75% of people in the trial will receive one of the medications, but it is worth pointing out again that we don't actually know if any of these are effective or not, and that's why it's ethical to randomise people to one of these or to best standard care.
Sure. And just one final question. I just wanted to ask you all to explain a little bit more about what these drugs do, because I think, Sharon, you've told me before, a drug either usually works by stopping the virus replicating or by actually helping the body respond. So maybe ramping up or damping down the immune system. And for example, for hydroxychloroquine, I'm saying it wrong, I apologize, but I hear that one can potentially do both. So it's been shown in a test environment to maybe kill the virus, but also that, you know, it's used for autoimmune conditions and things like that. So could you just expand a little bit more on, I guess, each strategy of the drug?
I might answer that actually, because I think I'm the only virologist on the panel here. Both of the drugs have direct activity against the virus itself, and we know that from studies in the test tube. So you look at the virus dividing, you add the drug, and you measure how much less virus there is in the presence of the drug. Both of these drugs have activity in the test tube model. They're not super potent drugs, but they definitely have activity. And as you correctly say, and Calitri is designed to target an HIV component, but it has some cross-reactivity with COVID-19 equivalent component. But you're right, hydroxychloroquine does actually also dampen down an immune response. And that may be an added benefit of this drug, but it does definitely have antiviral activity in a test tube model.
Does that mean you could even use these drugs potentially as preventative treatments? So say giving them proactively to healthcare workers like they're trialling at the Walter and Eliza Hall Institute and things like that?
Yes, that's right. It can be used, if it's working as an antiviral, it could potentially protect you from becoming infected, as we know happens, say, with HIV drugs. HIV drugs that work to treat the virus can also be used to protect you from becoming infected, and that's the rationale.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll move on to the next question. Thanks, Sharon. Over to Natasha Robinson. You're using an older version of Zoom, I'm afraid. So it says here that I'm going to have to promote you to a panelist just to talk. So just bear with me for a minute. Natasha, can you go ahead with your question? I'm really sorry. I've unmuted you.
Thank you. I just had a question. I may have missed this, but the total number of people that will participate in the clinical trial and how long is it expected to run?
Steve, I'll get you to answer that.
Sure. At the moment, we're calculating to aim for over 2,000 patients and to run over the next 12 to 18 months. Your question therefore raises an important issue in that the numbers of COVID-19 infections have obviously been dropping in Australia, which is a great thing, and it's a really good problem for us to have within the trial itself. And that's part of the reason why we're now seeking overseas partners to join ASCOT to try and bolster the numbers that can join the trial. And as Josh has mentioned, having the majority of major hospitals in Australia and New Zealand as partners means that we're as best placed as possible to recruit participants as they present. And even though those numbers might be at this stage a little bit smaller than we initially expected.
Okay, thank you for your question, Natasha. Over to Annie Kearney. Go ahead, Annie, please tell us where you're from.
Hi, it's Annie Kearney from Channel 10 in Melbourne. My question is, it says that patients are being actively screened. Does that mean that any have been recruited so far?
Steve?
So we haven't actually recruited anyone so far because of the drop in numbers in the last few days. So the Royal Melbourne Hospital opened for recruitment as of last week. And I think as of today, the Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital also. And we have, I think, about 20 hospitals that we think will come online within the next fortnight. So it takes time to get ethics and various governance procedures approved at each individual hospital. But as we stand at the moment, there's 2 hospitals which are open. We haven't recruited any participants yet, but we're ready and waiting.
And just one more while I've got you. You said you were seeking overseas members to join ASCOT. Could you just talk us through what countries and what the process is behind that?
The main country at this stage is Singapore, and we are approaching other collaborators, which I won't say too much about at this stage because they're not very advanced in those discussions. But we are trying to reach out. The ACID Clinical Research Network has conducted some of it.
We're just losing you there, Steve. Would you like to go ahead with, can you, I think you're back, Steve.
Okay, how much did you miss then? Most of it?
Just repeat.
Can we get the whole thing? Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. So we are approaching overseas partners. The one that's most advanced in discussions is with Singapore. The ACID Clinical Research Network has conducted a number of studies over the last few years with overseas partners, and we've been approaching some of them to gauge their interest and capacity in joining in ASCOT.
Okay, thanks, Annie. Over to Sue Dunleavy. Please go ahead with your question. Tell us where you're from.
Hello, Sue Dunleavy from News Corp papers, including the Daily Telegraph and Herald Sun. I'm going to ask why you picked Calitri, because there have been a number of trials of this medication worldwide against COVID, and it hasn't appeared to be terribly successful at this stage. Do you think it will work on its own? And has it been tried anywhere else in combination with hydroxychloroquine? And do you think that the combination is likely to be more successful than the drug on its own?
I might ask Susan to respond to that.
Hi, thanks, Sharon. I'm not sure, I couldn't quite hear all of the question very well, but I gather it was, do we think that Calitri is going to work better with hydroxychloroquine than on its own? Yeah. And yes, I mean, we do have what we call equipoise for that question. It's possible that that Calitri may work on its own or may not, and it's possible that it may work better with hydroxychloroquine than on its own. And so really those are answers that we need, that we think the ASCOT trial may be able to find those answers in a standardised way because of the nature of the randomised controlled trial.
And I think the first part of the question that you might have missed was, given other studies in Calitri, can you justify using Calitri in this study?
Yes, I think we can, because we're planning on having large enough numbers to be able to actually answer the question decisively in the ASCOT study.
Okay, thanks for your question, Sue. I'll now hand over to Kingy Gilbert. Please go ahead with your question.
Kia ora. My name is Kingy Gilbert. I'm from New Zealand. I'm working on a joint science communications initiative with the National Iwi Radio to get message to Māori and Pacific communities. This is very important for us because Māori and Pacific are shown to be very susceptible to COVID. And there was recently released research showing that Māori would be 4 to 5 times more heavily impacted by COVID. So there's obviously a intense gaze on our medicines, and ngā mihi koutou, thank you very much. My questions are, when will we see impacts or results released, and will there be some kind of ethnic basis to the reporting, i.e. returning results on Māori ethnicity or Pacific? Kia ora.
Great, thank you. I might just get David to respond to that.
Thanks very much. So certainly the first question in terms of when are results going to come through, it's so dependent really on recruitment. You know, we've got the infrastructure set up, 70 hospitals across Australia, 11 across New Zealand. You know, we're ready and waiting. And, you know, we've seen in, unfortunately, Singapore and Japan that there have been really significant second waves of infection. And so we'll be there very much ready to enroll those patients and get the results as quickly as possible. I mean, we're desperate. We really want to find results as quickly as we can and communicate those to the Australian and New Zealand communities. Perhaps Susan might be best placed to answer the question on ethnic reporting in New Zealand, if that's okay, Sharon.
Yeah, sure. Over to you, Susan.
Hi. Kia ora, Kingy. Thanks for your question. Yes, we also share your thoughts and concerns about the effect of COVID-19 on our Māori and Pacific people. And we certainly have ensured that we will be able to report by ethnic status. So we have a question in our data capture, which is for people to select up to 2 different ethnicities that they feel they belong to, and that includes Māori and Pacific. And in New Zealand, the Pacific group is able to be broken down into the various Pacific nations. But even among Australians, we're also going to be collecting data on Māori and Pacific people, because we realise that there are also significant populations of our people living in Australia as well.
Hilda, thank you. You guys are awesome.
I'm now going to ask Tiffany Walker. Please ask your question.
Hi there, I'm Tiffany from Farm in Focus. Could you explain the significance of this study? From my understanding, both these drugs are already being trialled in Australia in the REM COVID study, I believe.
Thank you, Tiffany. I might get Josh to answer that.
Yeah, so there's an existing study in Australia and other countries called REMAP-CAP, which is restricted to severely ill patients who require admission to the intensive care unit. And we've designed the ASCOT study to be complementary to the REMAP-CAP study, in that we're only enrolling patients who are sick enough to be in hospital, but not so sick that they've needed to go to intensive care and need a ventilator. And the idea of ASCOT is, our hope, or the question we're asking is, can these drugs prevent deterioration of patients to the point where they need to go to ICU? So I think there's definitely a need for studies both in ICU and in ward patients, and that's really the key place of ASCOT. I guess secondly, other people have alluded to the fact that large studies are being done in other countries of similar interventions, and we've worked with investigators from those studies to make sure that our trials are harmonised, so we're collecting similar endpoints and information. So that we'll be able to combine our findings together to be more powerful.
Thank you.
I muted myself. Over to Claire. Please go ahead.
Hi, it's Claire from News here. I'm just wondering, if anything so much hype over hydroxychloroquine.
Claire, you're just quite muffled. Would you mind repeating your question?
Sure. I'll try and speak more clearly. It's Claire from News. I'm just wondering, if there hadn't been so much hype over hydroxychloroquine, would it have been part of these clinical trials?
Sorry, Claire, I'll just stop you again. You're just cutting in and out of being muffled.
I could hear the question.
Could hear the question? Okay,
yeah.
sure.
I think the question, Claire, was if there hadn't been so much hype about hydroxychloroquine, would that drug have been included in the trial? Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Very interesting question. Steve, I'll hand over to you.
Sure. It was actually quite interesting in that there was a very early report of the efficacy of hydroxychloroquine in the test tube very early on, I think even in February. And that was before all the hoo-ha occurred with that Didier Raoult paper and Donald Trump getting on board with that. So even at that stage, we were thinking that hydroxychloroquine was going to be one of the agents in this study. And of course, everything happened subsequent to that. As I say, we've been keeping a pretty close eye on what's been happening overseas. And it's probably fair to say, some conflicting results. Some studies which show that there might be effectiveness in people, but other studies which suggest that it may not work as well as initially hoped. And all those studies suffer somewhat from not having sufficient numbers and not being sufficiently well designed to really answer the important questions that we're seeking to answer. So at this stage, I think, yes, it is it's important for us to address the questions around hydroxychloroquine, and it was something we might be able to even claim that we thought about early on before Donald Trump got involved.
Thanks.
Okay, over to Kirsten Lawson.
Hi, from the Canberra Times. Can I ask 3 questions in one, please? Is this trial blind?
Sorry, Kirsten, we just lost you there for a minute.
We just lost you. So is the trial blinded? And
Yes. What are the risks to patients and how likely are sort of severe side effects? And my 3rd question, can someone outline the differences between this trial and the preventive trial that's being conducted or is to be conducted among hospital staff, for example, in the dosing of the medication or other differences?
Thank you, Kirsten. That's 4 questions, but we're okay with that. So David, blinded study, the risks and severe side effects, and I'll get Josh to talk about the difference to prevention.
So we know that blinded studies, in other words, both the patients and also the doctors don't know what the medication is that they're receiving, is really the most rigorous way to conduct a trial. But unfortunately, being able to develop matched placebos is a process that typically takes months and months. And so we really thought that it wasn't practical to have a blinded study, and therefore it's going to be what's called open label. But because our endpoints are very objective, it's someone
Sorry,
going
David, I'm just going to jump in and ask anyone that's other than David to mute their microphones. We can hear keyboard tapping in the back, and this is being recorded. Thank you. Go ahead, David.
So one reason why we think this trial doesn't need to be blinded is that the outcomes, which is someone needing to go to ICU or someone needing to be on a mechanical ventilator, that's very, very clear cut and isn't something that's subjective. And so that's why we think it could be done in an unblinded way, as well as the practical aspects of getting it rolled out as quickly as possible. Any medication has some potential side effects, and hydroxychloroquine and also lopinavir, ritonavir have a known array of side effects because they've been available clinically for many, many years. What we don't know is whether in patients with COVID-19 there might be some specific side effects, And one thing we are going to be watching and monitoring for very, very closely is any potential cardiac toxicity, because people may have seen written that both of these drugs could affect the heart in a particular way. And that's something that we'll be really vigorously trying to avoid, but also trying to monitor closely. And of course, drugs in combination, you know, are they more effective, or are you just giving more side effects? So lots of unanswered questions, but that's why we do trials, to really try and get to the bottom of these unresolved questions.
Thanks, David. And Josh, maybe I'll get you to comment on the dosage in this study and the dosage in the prevention trial and how they're different.
Yeah, sure. So the prevention trial, just to clarify, is we'll be enrolling healthcare workers who are well, and they will be taking hydroxychloroquine daily over a number of weeks. I think it's for 3 months, to see if it will prevent infection in them. Our trial is taking people who've been diagnosed with coronavirus disease and hospitalised because of it, and that we're using a significantly higher dose for a much shorter period of time than the prevention trial. So in our trial, people get a complete course of 7 days rather than 3 months, and for higher doses for that period of time.
Okay. Sue Dunleavy, you have another question?
Yes, you're looking at drugs that are already available and approved for use in Australia. One of the other potential treatments that's popped up in recent weeks has been the drug Ivermectin, which is used to treat head lice and other sort of illnesses. Is that something that you'd think about putting into this trial and seeing if it has any effect? Because it's shown some effect in a test tube as well.
Steve, maybe you want to comment about ivermectin?
Well, yeah, great question. And ivermectin is a drug that's been widely used for parasitic diseases around the world, including in mass drug administration. So it's got a really good safety record also. It's been absolutely correct. It's shown activity in the test tube. And what we're not sure is whether the dose that's required for that activity, whether that's achievable in people. And there's going to be quite a bit of work leading up to deciding whether it should be used in patients or not. And that work's proceeding at the moment, including at the Doherty and at the Monash University. And we're waiting to see the results of some of those additional laboratory studies before we consider it further. And ASCOT will have the capacity to bring in new treatments like ivermectin if they get to the point where it's considered that they should be tested in humans.
Okay, there are no more questions up on my screen. Are there any final questions for our panel today? Annie Kearney, go ahead again, please.
Thank you. Sorry, just one more. Joshua, you were just talking about the medication, how it's just the drug that's used for malaria is just a 7-day course. Is that correct? And what is the course for the other medication?
The other medication, lopinavir, ritonavir, or Calitri, as the brand name, is given for 10 days. And the reason we're using a shorter duration for the hydroxychloroquine is that that drug has a very long half-life, meaning it lasts in the bloodstream for many days after the course is completed.
Thank you.
Tiffany, you have another question. Go ahead, Tiffany.
Supplying Calitri and who will be supplying hydroxychloroquine?
So you might just have to repeat your question. You just didn't catch the start.
Will AbbVie be supplying Calitri and who will be supplying hydroxychloroquine?
Steve, we'll get you to answer that one.
Well, so the Calitri is being supplied by a company called Mylan. AbbVie is providing quite a lot of drug to the Commonwealth for use either in trials or potentially outside of that. And the hydroxychloroquine has been sourced from Sanofi. And the way we've organised it is that all the drugs, study drugs, are going to the Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital, Central Pharmacy, who are labelling and packaging the study drugs for distribution to all the study sites.
Sharon, you have another question. Go ahead, please.
Oh, yes, sorry, I'll just sneak in again. I guess, you know, in the broader context of this, while the world's sort of also working on a vaccine, how are you all feeling going into this really big trial about, you know, whether or not a treatment might be a real game changer in how the world tackles this pandemic?
I might ask Susan to respond to that.
Sure, thanks. Well, obviously, you know, ASCOT would love to be part of a game changer and finding a treatment that would be safe and effective for COVID-19. That's why we're doing this. And in terms of finding a vaccine, obviously, you know, if we can, the world scientists can come up with a vaccine for COVID as soon as possible, that will be great. It will take time for such a vaccine to be produced and rolled out across the world. And so I think that having a safe and effective treatment for COVID-19 will still be really important. In addition, Sharon, you know, the ASCOT study will enable collection of many different types of samples from participating patients who consent for that. And, you know, so it might actually be a really important part of investigating the immune response and helping with vaccine development.
Yeah, I thought I might also ask Andrew to comment, because Andrew spoke about the incredible support that Minoru provided for the COVID-19 response and what his thinking was around supporting a treatment trial here.
Well, thank you, Sharon. It was important to us to make sure that work that we support was internationally wise, being performed by people who, as you can tell this morning, are well connected globally, and that successful work would reap its dividend around the world. And so that was one of the key factors that we looked at in selecting this trial as a trial to support with $1 million, and we're very pleased to do so.
Okay, final question to Sue Dunleavy.
As I understand it, the drug Calitri was used on some patients in hospitals on the Gold Coast. Can you tell me what you learned from that? Did it seem to make any difference? Did these people recover? Did it prevent them from dying? Did it make any difference to their treatment?
I'll get Steve to answer that, even though we do have a Queenslander online here, David, but I'm trying to share the love a bit, and we all are familiar with these cases. So Steve, maybe I'll get you to respond, and David might have some more local knowledge, being very close to the Gold Coast.
Sure, thanks, Sharon. Look, we heard on one of our kind of email distribution lists about, I think it was about 5 patients on the Gold Coast, of which some received Calitri. My understanding is that they all improved. But with such small numbers and in a kind of uncontrolled, non-randomized fashion, it's you really can't tell whether that improvement was because that patient was just going to improve anyway, or if it was because of the Calitri. And again, that's why we feel that we need to do these kinds of trials.
All right, back to you, Sharon, to close it out.
Okay, well, thanks very much. This is a new way of doing business with an online press conference, but I think it worked very smoothly. I'd like to thank all of our panel members, thank the Minoru Foundation again and Andrew Hager for their generous support, and thank the Doherty communications team for setting this all up. And we look forward to getting back to you in the next few weeks to months about progress on this important study. Thanks, everyone.